Namaste and good evening. I think we should start. My name is Ashok Gurung. I'm the director of India-China Institute and a faculty member in the graduate program in international affairs at the New School. It is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome all of you. This is a very special evening for the India-China Institute as we welcome the former UN envoy to Nepal, Ian Martin. We're very mindful of the fact that holding any kind of events on a Friday, especially if event happens to be on substantive topic, is not an easy thing to do in New York City. For that reason also, I just want to thank you again for choosing to spend the Friday evening with us here. Special thanks to many highly distinguished colleagues from the UN. Especially we have the current UNMIN chief, Ms. Karen Langren. I hope I didn't totally butcher your name. And also Nepal's permanent representative to the UN, our ambassador, Madhu Raman Acharya, who has been extremely supportive of India-China Institute, so thank you for coming. I would like to say a few words about our format tonight. When Ian is done speaking, we will have 3 additional discussants who will speak for approximately 5 minutes apiece. Following that, we will have Q&A session, which I hope will allow us to really have an engaging conversation. Before formally introducing our featured speaker today, I would like to briefly introduce our additional discussants for tonight's event. Professor Andrew Arato is the Dorothy Hart Harshan Professor of Political and Social Theory at the New School for Social Research. Professor Arato, his earlier work has looked at neo-Marxist thought and civil society. In his more recent work, Professor Arato has focused on constitutions, both theoretically and in practice, recently focusing on Iraq, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. He also gave one of the more memorable responses to the speech given here last fall by former Prime Minister Prachanda. He's a highly valued colleague and a friend of Nepal Democracy and Development Initiative at the India-China Institute. Next, Kulchandra Gautam. As many of you know, Mr. Gautam recently retired from a distinguished career as the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF. During his tenure with the United Nations, Mr. Gautam provided key leadership in shaping policy and mobilizing governments, development agencies, NGOs, and corporate sector around issues of rights and human development, children's rights and human development. He continues to write and speak against the violence and violations of human rights by all parties during the conflict in Nepal. As a senior fellow of India-China Institute, he has been a great friend on a number of issues related to democracy and development initiative here at the New School. Then Deepak Thapa, a friend who is the director of Social Science Baha in Kathmandu. Deepak is one of the highly respected Nepali journalists who has written prolifically on contemporary Nepal. He is also one of the few people who truly understands the Maoist movement, both in its infancy and the place it occupies now in Nepali society. So I want to thank all 3 of them for joining us. Let me take another couple of minutes to note that we are delighted to have with us this evening a few prominent public intellectuals, and in my judgment, the best journalists from Nepal, Prasant Jha and Aditya Adhikari. They are somewhere right in the back. They happen to be here for a book project being facilitated by NYU. I'm also happy to inform you that Mahendra Lawati, another friend, a respected scholar on Nepal, who teaches at Western Michigan University, has now a new co-edited book, The Maoist Insurgency in Nepal, A Revolution in the 21st Century. And his book on federal state building is on sale outside the room. It's only $10, and the proceeds will be donated to a scholarship program in Nepal. So I would encourage you to buy the book. Now, it's my great pleasure tonight to introduce someone who is an honored diplomat, a respected peacemaker, a great friend of Nepal, and now also a neighbor of the new school. He just lives nearby. Ian Martin. Ian Martin has a long history in the human rights field, working for the United Nations in countries such as Rwanda and East Timor, and most recently overseeing the remarkable transition in Nepal. Ian played an important role in facilitating the process by which the disparate parties came together to sign the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2006. This was followed by the successful historic constitution elections in April 2008. Ian's talk today is timely because it coincides with the most recent UN report on Nepal, which I'm sure Ian played a role in it, and I'm sure Karen did too, and which has generated great discussion in Nepal right now. As most of you know, since 1950, the United Nations' role in Nepal has been large and central to the development of the country. There is no denying that at times the role of the UN and also of important international actors such as India has been controversial in Nepal. It is evident from the recent news reports and analysis that both Ian and the UN has been on the hot seat in Nepal. This unique challenge for the United Nations is best summed up by the recent International Crisis Group report on Nepal, which states, quote, "The UN would like to claim to success and get out, but cannot refuse requests to monitor arms as long as the situation over which it has no direct influence remains unresolved. In the meantime, its role in preserving a fragile peace and affording Nepal some shelter from total Indian domination is underappreciated." End quote. I have read the UN report and believe its analysis and ultimate recommendation to be worthy of very serious consideration. Contrary to the government announcement and the voices of few within the elites, I believe that findings of this report offers an important challenge to the country's political parties. That challenge is to genuinely work together so as to fully grab hold of this historic opportunity to restructure the country, to establish a constitutional framework for a genuine, inclusive democracy. If such a challenge is taken up, in my view, this will allow the majority of the people to gain a voice within the government and to become active participants and stakeholders in creating a peaceful and prosperous Nepal. Considering the highly polarized politics and recent pronouncements by the ruling elites and the government in Nepal on the UN report, I would suspect that Ian is going to provide, as most highly successful diplomats do, a careful assessment on Nepal's peace process. At the same time, having sacrificed a valuable Friday evening, I suspect the audience wants a bit more and, quote, undiplomatic, if I may use the word, or let's say more analytical and thought-provoking conversation. For this to happen, you, the audience, and the discussants will have to be equally probing and engaging in today's conversation. To this end, we hope that the Q&A session becomes more of an exchange where we follow a bit of the new school's tradition of critical inquiry and less of the UN's diplomatic traditions. Now, please join me in welcoming Ian Martin, our featured speaker. Thank you.
Namaste and good evening from me too. I'm very grateful to Ashok for asking me to speak here at the new school. As Ashok knows, it was many weeks ago that you asked me to do this and to propose a title for my talk. Alas, I didn't know then just how appropriate this title was going to prove by tonight. In recent days, there have been calls for the revision of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, accusations and counter-accusations that it is being broken by Maoist agitation or threats of mobilization of the army, and calling into question even of the 12-point understanding, which was the very foundation of Nepal's peace process. So I think it is indeed timely to ask whether the peace process is failing, if so, why, and what is required to save it. Indeed, for over 3.5 years, I spoke in Nepal and on Nepal on behalf of the United Nations, first on behalf of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, up to and during the Jana Andolan, and then representing the Secretary General. I want to make very clear that I no longer speak for the United Nations on Nepal, and tonight I'm speaking only for myself. Some may question my right to speak critically of events in Nepal, but I do so solely as a friend of Nepal and as someone who deeply wants to see Nepal go forward in peace, respect for human rights, and socio-economic progress for all its diverse peoples. So I hope I may, to some extent, be speaking in a different voice from the diplomatic one that Ashok expects of me. And in another sense, too, I want to speak tonight in a different voice. In Kathmandu, one tries to follow the details of every twist and turn of the complex politics of Nepal and whatever is reported in the daily media, and in the positions I held, in the position that Karen now holds, was very often expected to comment on it. It's easy then to fail to see the wood for the trees, and hard to maintain a focus on the deeper realities of the situation. Here in New York, it's more like looking through the other end of the telescope. And sitting as I am briefly in the UN's Department of Political Affairs, which follows and sometimes mediates conflicts around the world, one has more of a comparative perspective. So this evening I want to try to address what I regard as the larger underlying issues of the peace process in Nepal, which I do in fact believe is the way to address the question of what needs to be done to get it back on track. Fundamentals of the peace process, as many of you know, but this is a diverse audience, were negotiated in the 12-point understanding, agreed in Delhi in November 2005 between the Communist Party of Nepal Maoists, which from now on I will refer to just as the Maoists, and the Seven-Party Alliance, the alliance of political parties who had been represented in the parliament elected in 1999 and dissolved in 2002, whose leading negotiators were from Girija Prasad Koirala's Nepali Congress. It was an unusual basis for a peace process because it was not an agreement between the rebels and those then in control of the state and its army, but an alliance to end control of the state by what it called autocratic monarchy. But as the literature expects peace processes to do, it did come out of a stalemate on the battlefield, the recognition of the Maoists that they would never be able to capture the state by force of arms, and the failure of the then Royal Nepalese Army to achieve victory over the Maoist People's Liberation Army, even when fully unleashed latterly by King Gyanendra. The bargain that was then struck between the two sides was crucial and needs to be remembered today. The Maoists committed themselves to the values and norms of multi-party democracy, human rights, and rule of law. The parliamentary parties accepted what had been the Maoist agenda of election of a constituent assembly and, quote, progressive restructuring of the state. The combatants on both sides of the armed conflict, the armed Maoist force and the Royal Army, as they were referred to in the 12-point understanding, would be kept under UN or other international supervision in the course of the election of a constituent assembly. 12-point understanding then became the basis on which the people of Nepal could unite under the leadership of civil society as much as of the political parties to express their demand for peace and change. Once the Jana Andolan had compelled the king to step aside, a fuller peace process began to be negotiated. The Seven-Party Alliance was now in the stronger position, The old parliament was reinstated as the basis for a Nepali Congress-led government, contrary to the Maoist proposal of a national political conference as the basis for an interim government. The new government had the command of the Nepalese army and the strong backing of the Indian and United States governments in insisting not only on cantonment of the Maoist army, as had been agreed in the 12-point understanding, but also what came to be called weapons separation before the Maoists could join an interim parliament and government. The Maoists eventually agreed to storage of their weapons under UN surveillance, but they did not agree to surrendering ultimate control. The fuller peace agreement that was then negotiated was enshrined in the Comprehensive Peace Agreement and then in the interim constitution. Since then, there have been numerous agreements which have for the most part repeated commitments to implement them, although they've also led to some revisions in the interim constitution. But 5 aspects of the peace agreements have been unchanging and, in my view, are fundamental, and it is the extent to which they have been respected or not respected which I want to examine this evening. The first fundamental is the commitment to power sharing and consensus. From the 12-point understanding on, the major parliamentary parties and the Maoists committed themselves to work together in an interim legislature and government. The interim constitution required the government to conduct itself, I quote again, consistently with the aspirations of the United People's Movement, political consensus, and culture of mutual cooperation. This requirement was to prevail not just until the election of the Constituent Assembly, but until a new constitution had been adopted. Before the election was held, the parties committed themselves, whatever the result, to continue to work together in a new interim government to steer Nepal through the process of drafting the new constitution. The assumption was that it would comprise all major parties in accordance with their respective strength at the ballot box. The second fundamental is the commitment of the Maoists to the transformation of their movement to conform to democratic multi-party norms and to respect the rule of law. This was to include allowing those from the other political parties whom they had displaced to return home, recover land and property unjustly seized, and carry on political activities. First made in the 12-point understanding, this commitment has been regularly reiterated, and once the Young Communist League had been established, has included a promise to end its paramilitary functioning. The third fundamental is the commitment to transformation in the security sector, to the integration and rehabilitation of former Maoist combatants, and to an action plan for democratization of the Nepalese army, determining its appropriate size, developing its national and inclusive character, and training it in the norms and values of democracy and human rights. The fourth fundamental is the commitment to political, economic, and social transformation. The Comprehensive Peace Agreement set out a radical and ambitious agenda, which included land reform and anti-corruption measures, as well as a general goal of economic security for backward communities. The interim constitution reflected in its preamble the commitment of the seven-party alliance, as well as the Maoists, to progressive restructuring of the state, in order, it said, to resolve the existing problems of the country relating to class, caste, region, and gender. The fifth and last fundamental is the commitment to address the needs of victims of the conflict and to build the rule of law by ending impunity. Repeated commitments have been made to investigate the fate of the disappeared, compensate victims of the conflict, enable displaced persons to return, establish a comprehensive truth commission, and, less frequently and more reluctantly, take action against those responsible for major human rights violations. Such commitments are actually common to peace processes, and one can perhaps say that they are requirements of a successful peace process. Transitional power sharing, democratic transformation, security sector reform, addressing root causes of the conflict, and ending impunity. So what so far has been the history of the fulfillment of each of these commitments in Nepal? The history of power sharing has been an unhappy one from the outset. The UML, as well as the Maoists, were forthright in protesting the lack of collective decision-making within the Nepali Congress-led governments, and the same complaint applied to the Maoist-led government after the election. Common minimum programs have been negotiated among coalition parties and then seemingly forgotten. Throughout successive governments, each party has tended to treat the ministries it controlled as its own fiefdom and a source of jobs and rewards for its own supporters, rather than advancing proposals for consensus decision-making in the public interest. This has had particularly adverse consequences for the peace process, in that the Ministry of Peace and Reconstruction has been from its creation a partisan ministry rather than a consensus mechanism of peace implementation. Maoist unhappiness at Nepali Congress control of the peace ministry led to a promise in the 23-point agreement of December 2007 to create a multi-party high-level peace commission alongside the ministry, but it was never created, and the Maoists were no more interested in creating it once they took control of the peace ministry than had been the Nepali Congress. The most serious breakdown in power sharing and consensus decision making, of course, came in the aftermath of the Constituent Assembly election. The outcome of the election had been and continues to be difficult for many in the non-Maoist parties to accept. The Maoists had to concede the creation of a presidency before the vote to implement the Republic went ahead, but they resisted the claim to the post made by the Nepali Congress as the second largest party. The election of outgoing Prime Minister Girija Prasad Koirala as president, while Maoist chairman Prachanda became Prime Minister, would have kept in play the uneasy partnership that had been the main pillar of the peace process, but the Maoists feared that it would lead to the presidency becoming a strong alternative power centre. Once Mr. Koirala was denied the presidency and the Nepali Congress was refused the defence ministry, the voices in that party which preferred to remain in opposition to a Maoist-led government prevailed. In the manoeuvring over posts, the Maoists also alienated the UML, and by the time the new coalition government was formed, relationships among the parties were perhaps irrevocably soured. The Maoists' main coalition partner, the UML, was also its main protagonist at the local level, where their youth groups clashed, sometimes with fatal consequences. Although two of the three Madhesi parties joined the government and the third initially supported it, the big three parties never brought Madhesi representatives into their main negotiations. The seven-party alliance, once the Maoists had joined it, had provided a forum where at critical moments a degree of consensus around the peace process could be re-established, but after the election, no such body was in operation. Power sharing and consensus building have failed at two further levels. The political parties have to this day been unable to rise above their partisan interests and agree on a formula to re-establish multi-party local government bodies, despite the fact that these are vital to the development agenda. Plans to establish local peace committees were not a substitute and have only been belatedly and partly implemented. The Constituent Assembly itself, although unwieldy as a decision-making body, is remarkably representative and has seen some promising alliances of women and marginalised groups across party lines. It could have been a forum for real debate and consensus building, instead of which all major parties have used it as a forum for confrontation with Madhesi parties, the Nepali Congress, the UML, and today the Maoists, all at different times engaging in blockages and boycotts instead of democratic debate. Today, some in Nepal argue that there is nothing uncommon in international democratic practice about a government based on a simple majority of the elected body. That's true enough, but before normal political competition can begin in Nepal, there is a peace process to complete, a constitution to agree upon as a framework for future competition. That is why we urged all parties to work together in government after the election, And from a peace process perspective, it is patently obvious that a peace process based on power sharing cannot be expected to succeed if not just one major party, but one side to the peace process is not part of the power sharing, especially if it happens to emerge from an election as the largest single party. This is not just a matter of one political party feeling aggrieved, but about maintaining a viable peace process, which I believe, although I had nothing to do with the current report of the Secretary-General, why I believe the Secretary-General has expressed his agreement with all those in Nepal who say that a national unity government is desirable now, as it has always been. The second fundamental of the peace process is the commitment of the Maoists to the transformation of their movement to conform to democratic multi-party norms and to respect the rule of law. Maoist leaders argue that this commitment is sincere and ask for recognition that the transformation of a movement based on armed struggle is bound to take time. So it is, of course. But they must expect to be judged by what they do as well as what they say, in private as well as in public. They created their Young Communist League not solely as a movement of law-abiding youth activists based in their own communities, but as a paramilitary formation in quasi-barracks under former commanders from the People's Liberation Army. They used it in the contest for the Constituent Assembly election to deny other parties the space in some localities for free and fair campaigning. During that campaign, their rhetoric played on fears of possible return to armed struggle to encourage voters to see the election of Maoists as the way to secure the peace. Public statements before and since the election have threatened revolt. What is known of internal debate has often suggested two lines, with the commitment to peaceful democratic practice uncertain in the long term. The Shaktikor video tape that many of you that will mean something to many, if not all of you, revealed a highly disturbing private discourse, as do statements or interviews by Maoist leaders which talk of final insurrection to capture state power. It is time for one line, not two, the line expressed in the 12-point understanding of unambiguous and lasting commitment to multi-party democracy. Some people saw the attempted replacement of the Chief of Army Staff by the Maoist majority in the cabinet as the last step in a creeping capture of the state. I see it in more complex terms, coming as it did after a series of highly political statements and interventions by the chief, which would have led to action in any country with democratic control of its armed forces. But democratic control does not mean partisan control. On the wider charge of state capture, the Maoists need to show a convincing commitment to independent state institutions, especially an independent judiciary. But so do other parties. Some aspects of alleged Maoist state capture seem not so very different from the way in which each party in government has sought to have its supporters in the institutions of the state. The third fundamental aspect of the peace process, the future of the armies which fought the war, is the hardest to assess because it was not fully negotiated. The Comprehensive Peace Agreement and the Interim Constitution only set out processes towards solutions, not the expected outcome. But despite suggestions to the contrary, the integration and rehabilitation of Maoist combatants, to be determined by the Special Committee, was intended and understood to mean integration of some Maoist combatants into state security forces, including the Nepalese army. The action plan for democratization of the Nepalese army was intended and understood to provide for a degree of downsizing and for recruitment which was more inclusive of underrepresented groups, as well as to replace control by the palace with control by the government. And the prohibition on any new recruitment by either army, which began in the ceasefire code of conduct, meant just that. No new recruitment, not recruitment to fill vacancies in an army swollen by wartime. The agreement significantly did not address the future of the paramilitary armed police force or of the Maoist militia. The Maoists were the first to break the ban on new recruitment. As the cantonments were being established in late 2006, they swelled the numbers there by bringing in young people, many of them minors, attracted by promises of salary payments and future recruitment into the security forces. Together with no planning and poor government performance, this contributed to abysmal living conditions in the cantonments. It also gave rise to long arguments over payments, as non-Maoist ministers resented being expected to fund the living costs and pay salaries for numbers of Maoist personnel they knew to be grossly inflated, and to do so by handing over lump sums which they knew would be used for wider party purposes, including sustaining the YCL. Meanwhile, the Nepalese army maintained that its formal acceptance of the authority of the interim governments and of the transition to a republic, distasteful as it was to many of its officers, meant that it was now democratized. In fact, accountability to the palace having come to an end, the army was more autonomous than ever, with no effective control by an acutely underdeveloped Ministry of Defence. Although the Comprehensive Peace Agreement required the Interim Council of Ministers to prepare and implement the action plan for the Nepalese army, the army has argued publicly that any downsizing should only be considered by a government elected under the new constitution, and openly rejected the government's stated commitment to recruitment of Madeshis. It went ahead with new recruitment to fill vacancies without prior notification to the Joint Monitoring Coordination Committee, which is responsible for monitoring the agreement on monitoring the management of arms and armies, where the prohibition of new recruitment had been reiterated, and where Nepalese parties had given final authority for reporting on compliance to the Special Representative of the Secretary-General. From very early on, the United Nations, wanting to prepare the ground for UNMIN's exit, pressed the parties to commence the processes they themselves had agreed. The Special Committee was eventually established in mid-2007, headed by the Nepali Congress Peace Minister. It met once, but never met again until it was reconstituted after the election. Neither the Maoist nor the non-Maoist parties made any effort to commence serious discussion on integration and rehabilitation. The Maoists did sometimes demand action on integration, especially when they were reflecting the frustration of those in the cantonments about the uncertainty of their future. But ultimately, their leaders preferred to leave it until after the election. The continued existence of their army strengthened their hand while the election was being held, and beyond, while settling its future was bound to be a difficult issue inside the party and the PLA. The other parties assumed that their position would be strengthened and that of the Maoists weakened after the election, when the issue of the armies would be easier to solve on their chosen terms. After the election, it was late October 2008 before the government announced the re-establishment of the Special Committee, only for it to give rise to objections from the Nepali Congress regarding lack of consultation, composition, and terms of reference. Thus, it was January before the new Special Committee held its first meeting. During the long period in which no serious negotiation or technical analysis of options had been taking place, public statements by political and military voices had demonstrated the clash of divergent opinions. The Maoists dragged their feet, they're still dragging their feet, on the discharge of those disqualified by UNMIN's verification, which should have been immediate. The Nepalese army's active lobbying against any integration of Maoist combatants into its ranks became a major element of the crisis which led to the downfall of the Maoist-led government, and today any progress is hostage to the overall absence of political cooperation. 3 years after Maoist combatants were cantoned and restrictions were placed on the Nepalese army, pending what was then to have been a June 2007 election, both armies are understandably restless. It is remarkable, in terms of any international comparison, that there have been so few serious breaches of agreements. And fortunately for the political leaders, UNMIN is available to be blamed when they do occur, rather than their own failure to address the issues that could lead beyond temporary arrangements. But it is laying up further problems for the future to increase rather than reduce the numbers of personnel for which the state has a responsibility, without any plan for the future of Nepal's security sector. An army of wartime proportions and a paramilitary raised to fight the Maoist insurgency whose numbers are being increased alongside commitments to Maoist former combatants and undertakings to increase recruitment of underrepresented groups. I shall say less about the fourth fundamental aspect of the peace process, the commitment to political, economic and social transformation, but not because I think it is less important. Those who talk of the Maoists joining the mainstream overlook the fact that while the former insurgents committed themselves to multi-party democracy and must be held to that commitment, they did not abandon their commitment to fundamental change. Indeed, the other political parties undertook to make such a commitment themselves. Insofar as this referred to the end of the monarchy, it's been accomplished. Insofar as it refers to restructuring the state, it is largely a matter for the new constitution and requires a restoration of political cooperation if consensus is to be reached in the Constituent Assembly, where even a two-thirds majority requires Maoist support. But 3 years since the Comprehensive Peace Agreement is long enough to lament the inability of politicians in Kathmandu, or for the most part locally, to cooperate so as to bring some dividends of peace and beginnings of change to the poor and marginalised majority of Nepal's people. No effort has been made to forge a common vision for the new Nepal that is so often spoken about. The fifth fundamental aspect of the peace process, the commitment to address the needs of victims of the conflict and to build the rule of law by ending impunity, sadly can also be quickly addressed. Each side of the former conflict is concerned for its own victims, but little concerned for those it made victims, or for those who were simply caught in the middle of a ruthless war. Processes for compensation have been inadequate, and a process for addressing post-conflict issues of land and property has been non-existent. 3.5 years after the first commitment in the ceasefire code of conduct to investigate the fate of the disappeared, a commission of investigation has yet to be established. Not a single person has been properly brought to justice for a major human rights violation committed during the armed conflict or since. The Nepalese army protects from the courts those involved in the killing of Maina Sunawa. The Maoists protect from the courts those involved in the killing of Ramhari Shrestha. And the Nepali Congress is uninterested in accountability for the killings of YCL cadres by the security detail of one of its election candidates. Major reports by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on mass disappearances and systematic torture by the Nepalese army and Maharajganj barracks and in Bardia district make no impact whatever on Kathmandu opinion. This summary of the non-implementation of key commitments of the peace process might be different if there had been serious mechanisms to monitor implementation. In the ceasefire code of conduct, the two sides said that they would arrange for monitoring by national and international monitoring teams. The short-lived ceasefire code of conduct monitoring committee, which did include individuals of some independence, ended with the comprehensive peace agreements, and undertakings to replace it came to nothing. In the full text of my speech, I go through all the further commitments made in various agreements to establish a high-level joint monitoring committee or a national peace and rehabilitation commission or a united monitoring mechanism to review implementation of commitments made to Madhesi parties, reiterated time and time again, including in the common minimum programs of both the last two governments. Yet despite these repeated commitments, there has been to this day no effective mechanism for monitoring implementation of the peace process, except for the agreement on monitoring the management of arms and armies, under which UNMIN regularly convenes the Joint Monitoring Coordination Committee, which has now held over 100 meetings. Independent monitoring is an area where Nepal's civil society might have played an important role. But despite the leading role which civil society, marginalised groups and women played in the Jana Andolan, peace process negotiations have been limited to a small group of political leaders, mostly from higher castes, and all of them men. Even if uninvited by the political parties, civil society actors might have mounted independent scrutiny of their fulfilment of their commitments. Instead, much of civil society has reverted to partisan perspectives. The agreements with Madhesi and Janjati groups must now be regarded as part of the peace process, and sincerity in their implementation is also crucial for building consensus around a new constitution. If this is the state of Nepal's peace process, is it bound to fail? You might by now be surprised to hear me say that while I think it is indeed in danger of failing, it is not yet bound to fail. And my suggestions for the way forward correspond to my analysis of its fundamentals. First, the commitment to power sharing and consensus building must be re-established. It should be reflected in a national unity government, including both sides to the original peace process and all major political forces, in accordance with commitments before the election and with the election outcome. Effective mechanisms should at last be established to implement and monitor implementation of peace process commitments and commitments to inclusion, and should include strong representation of women and marginalized groups and independent civil society voices. Power sharing and consensus building should similarly be applied in local government. At the national level, of course, priority should be given to building consensus around a new constitution. The Constituent Assembly should be a place of vigorous debate and should never be impeded in its functioning, either as an interim legislature or as a constitution-making body, or restricted in its right to discuss major national issues. The parties should cooperate together and with civil society in a mechanism to ensure continuous implementation of peace process commitments and resolve the most difficult issues for the new constitution. Second, the Maoist leadership must be consistent in public and in private, in words and in deeds, in its immediate and long-term commitment to democratic multi-party norms. The YCL and indeed other youth movements must be instructed in these norms and in full respect for the rule of law. The sincerity of the leadership is to be judged by the action it takes when its cadres act outside these norms, and by what it says to its comrades as well as to the international community. Third, hard discussions should take place towards an overall plan for the security sector. Civilian supremacy has become a Maoist slogan, but democratic control of the armed forces is a universal principle and the common interest of all political parties. Within such a plan, the size of the Nepalese army and the role of the armed police force should be decided, inclusive recruitment policies designed, and integration of former Maoist combatants into politically neutral army security forces carried out, along with rehabilitation of those who do not want or qualify for integration. Fourth, a common minimum program for socio-economic advancement of the poor and excluded should be agreed upon and implemented, while restructuring the state is to be agreed upon in the new constitution, and political parties will compete in future on the basis of their respective programs. They have agreed to embark together on real change. Fifth, there should be equitable compensation for all categories of victims of the conflict, real efforts to investigate disappearances, and justice for the worst abuses by either side. All political parties should support impartial law enforcement instead of protecting their own loyalists from the law. Can this happen? At this moment, I don't know, and it may even seem unlikely. But I believe that this is along the lines of what the overwhelming majority of Nepal's long-suffering people would want to see happen. And I believe that it is in the interests of those concerned for stability in Nepal, including India. When I went back to the 12-point understanding, I was struck by one of its least often quoted commitments, that both the Maoists and the parliamentary parties would engage in soul-searching and not repeat their mistakes of the past. I hope that this commitment can be implemented in time to maintain the peace and pursue the change which both sides promised the people of Nepal. Thank you.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I will limit myself to a few remarks that touch upon various issues that Ian has raised. One is, of course, the difficulty that the international community has had prior to 2006 to recognize the Maoists as a political entity, and especially in the post-9/11 world, where the focus was so much on terror and terrorism. It was very difficult to try and convince, especially the internationals, and because the political forces within Nepal, including the King's regime and the other political parties, were hell-bent on using the 9/11 argument to try and portray the Maoists as terrorists. It was very difficult at the time. Having said that, they are a political force with a military agenda, with the intent of capturing state by any means, and I'm sure they still want to do that if they could, but then I'm sure they realize that it's not possible through armed insurrection anymore. Having said that, they are a political force. They are pretty much like any of the political forces that we've seen in Nepal, and that is the tragedy. Ian mentioned the root causes. This is one of the questions one often asked the people who were close to the Maoists back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, whether the Maoists are going to be any different. And the answer one often received was that they're coming, if they come to power, they'll have come. At that time, it was on over the lives of around 1,000 people or so. And they said that, yes, they are going to be different, but one always had one's doubts. And it is beginning to be seen right now that they are not really committed to total transformation, although that is the revolutionary slogan that catapulted them to this position of prominence at the moment. They have made some very interesting, very important contributions to the political sphere in Nepal. One of them is trying to bring in the excluded groups. Now, whether this was willingly or whether this was a tactic in the larger strategy of gaining support from themselves. In 2001, when they demanded, among other things, a roundtable conference of political parties and non-political actors also, I think, and this is one of the points that Ian also makes when he mentions that the various agreements made with the Madhesis and the Janjatis and the Muslims are part of the peace agreement. It certainly is. One can't ignore them. But the only problem is that if you look at all of these agreements, they're so contradictory to what has been laid out in the Constitution. And, of course, the intent of the political parties in power is something else also. I believe that in 2006, rather than go the way that the political parties ultimately went with the reinstatement of parliament and then an election to a constituent assembly, rather than that, perhaps if there had been a larger political dialogue between the political parties and the various groups that had been excluded from the political process until then, perhaps the kind of difficulties that we are seeing at the moment might not have been evident as right now. That would not have led to the various movements that we're seeing, especially in the Tarai and in the East, and the possible movements that are likely in various parts of the country. The other issue that Ian mentioned was about the question of the army and the distinction that he made between democratic control and partisan control. And that is an issue that the political parties have failed to realize, and they still do not seem to have woken up to the fact that the army has now become the strongest institution in Nepal, and that is very dangerous. I mentioned a couple of days ago this rather ridiculous spectacle of ministers, Nepal's government ministers, standing in line along with many other ordinary, I don't know what you call them, well-wishers or people like who are intent on providing this hallowed institution of chakari to the new power. Ministers were standing in line to congratulate the army chief. I really don't understand that. And by becoming the strongest institution of the state, it is going to resist calls for what will fundamentally alter the character of the army also, which is the whole question of making it more inclusive. we have an army that excludes nearly 50% of the population of the country. And that certainly cannot serve as a national army. And that has to change somehow. And there is some degree of lack of clarity also evident when I'm still dealing with the question of the army. There are these two issues of the democratic army, a democratized army, and a professional army. A democratic army, by which we mean an army that is under civilian control, and a professional army, which basically means that which implies that the PLA or the Maoist army is not a professional army, and they need to be schooled in the accoutrements of an army, learn how to salute, carry a swagger stick in a proper way, and so on, and so that they become a professional army. Which again militates against this whole idea of what a professional army is. The literature is quite clear that a professional army is what a democratic army is. But the Maoists also have a different conception of what a democratic army is, and this is something perhaps they don't quite often talk about in detail with international interlocutors, which is basically that a democratic army is the kind of army, and this is from their writings, which come out mostly in their Nepali writings. By that they mean an army which discusses everything that is to be done with the institution. For instance, you're going to decide whether you're going to change your rations. Then all the generals and everyone sit down and decide what you're going to do with the rations. That's what they mean by a democratic army, because that's how they functioned. That's what they mean by democratizing the army, because that's how they functioned during the time of the fighting, because you had. Oops. Oh, that's what it's for. Sorry. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Well, anyway, I think I'll just end with the first observation that Ian mentioned, was that one has to recognize the many compromises that the Maoists have made. There are many problems with the Maoist party, but then one has to understand that if we're going to look for peace, one has to recognize the various compromises that they've made with themselves, with their ideologies, whatever they were, because they tend to shift from time to time. And until we recognize that until we recognize these compromises, then we will not be able to accept them as a political force. Thank you.
Let me speak from here. First of all, Ashok, what a delight to be in this particular room. I remember on the 26th of September 2008, we were in this room with Prachanda and the delegation from Nepal. And I recall he looked at Lenin and Gandhi. And you might remember better than I do, he talked about, yes, we want some kind of a fusion between Lenin and Gandhi. And indeed, I kind of wish that such a fusion were possible. And from my own bias, I wish that such a fusion would happen with a little higher dose of Gandhi and a little lower dose of Lenin. If that were possible, that would be wonderful. But when one speaks about fusion, I must say, I have recently been reading, I don't know how many of you have read, Baburam Bhattarai's interview, which is all about fusion, except that it's not a fusion of Lenin and Gandhi, it's the fusion of the protracted people's war and urban insurrection. Those are the fusions that he's talking about. Everything else, in terms of the various agreements that have been signed, if you read his article, would say, well, those were just tactical maneuvers. Everything else is tactical. So when Deepak ji says, we do need to recognize the compromises that they have made. True, I think they have made quite a few compromises. But most of those compromises are tactical compromises, not the fundamental issues. And so the two words that frighten me most in Nepali politics today is fusion and tactical. I would be very careful. Now, to comment on the wonderful presentation that Ian and both Deepak ji made, I have always had such an enormous respect for Ian Martin and Pradeep Thapa ji that my natural inclination is to say, yes, I agree with what you say. And, you know, to a very large extent, that is true. My respect for Ian Martin has risen even higher today, having heard his analysis and his, very thoughtful presentation. Ian, you will recall, last year, when we had a round table of the donors, the Nepal Development Forum in Kathmandu, I was asked to chair. I said at that time that in my long career at the United Nations, I had a chance to work with many SRSGs and special envoys. And in my honest judgment, Ian was among the very best in the whole world. And today, I can say, yes, indeed. Look at the kind of wonderful presentation, very frank, very open, very candid, very honest presentation he made. And similarly, I know Pradeep ji. Pradeep ji is one of our gurus. He knows more about the Maoists than any of us have done. So I have tremendous respect for his views. So frankly, I do agree with almost all of what they say. Now, on the 5 fundamental transformations that Ian spoke about, I think we all agree with them. Those are needed. However, not all of those fundamentals are of equal importance in the long run. I mean, if we take, there are certain things that are very important today, but there are certain things that, for example, the very first one on we'll work together by consensus and cooperation, that's important today. That was agreed to. But in a democracy, yes, you may or you may not, you rule by majority, etc. Those things in the long run is not that fundamental. It's important now. Whereas point number 2, the transformation, belief in a pluralistic multi-party democracy, that is of importance not just today, not just tomorrow, it is important for 100 years. So these are of different importance. And I would say that in terms of the progress we are making, I completely agree with Ian. I think it's a very checkered progress. On the whole, we cannot be happy with the progress that has been made. But what I worry most about are those transformations that are going to be so vital for the long run. I think we should really pay particular attention to those. Since we have very little time, I would like to make 2 comments. One is on the Secretary General's report. Ashok ji, when you said the Secretary General's report on which we had some negative comments from the government and from the elites, I thought you might almost add elites and feudals and imperialists and capitalists. I'm sorry, I think that's a loaded word. Elites, yes, but non-elites too can be critical. By the way, I'm not critical. I would say that, in my view, the government's reaction when they said that on the unity government that this was interference, etc., I totally disagree with the government. I support the Secretary General's position. I think this is a sensible, reasonable proposition that the Secretary General has made. I have a natural inclination. I'm a creature of the UN. I have a natural inclination to be generally supportive of the UN. I have been always supportive of UNMIN. Even before UNMIN was created, as Ian Martin will recall, I was one of the first Nepalis to call for stronger UN good offices. So I tend to be generally pro-UN, pro-UNMIN. And in the case of this commentary that has come from the 22 parties in the government, I am with the Secretary General, not with the government. Having said that, it does not mean that everything in the report is honky-dory. Even non-elites, Ashok, can be critical of this. And I would be critical of a number of areas. Now, I don't want to go into the details on what are some things. There are certain things that are a little imbalanced. I'd be happy to give my feedback to Karin Landgren where they are imbalanced. But basically, I would say this. When the comment came from Nepal, on that particular point, I think the government is wrong and the UN is right. However, I recall, I used to work at UNICEF. We had a famous Sri Lankan journalist named Tarji Vitaji. He was one of our deputy executive director. In front of his office, he used to have a sign that said, everything is about something else. And indeed, in this case, this commentary is also about something else. And that something else is that in the report, there are certain things not wrong by commission, but wrong by omission, which lead to a certain imbalance. But I just wanted to say that. But on the whole, I am always with UNMIN, with the SG's report. Now, final point, since we have too little time. Good news. On transformation number 3 that Ian spoke about, which is so important, on security sector reform and integration and rehabilitation, I would say that my own, in the last 2-3 months, I have had an opportunity to interact with a whole spectrum of people, from the Barsaman Pun of the Maoist and General Fudong of the Maoist, to Bidya Bhandari of the Defense Minister, to General Gurung, to all the members of the Special Committee and all the members of the Technical Committee over a long period of time, to whom I had made a proposal in an open forum, indicating certain ways in which we could make progress on integration and rehabilitation and democratization of the army and downsizing, all of those issues that are so important. And you know, when you make a case that is made in a way that this is not to favor the Maoist side or the Congress or the UML or the Nepali army, but this would be in the larger interest of Nepal, people actually say yes. So I can see precisely, I can see a settlement it is staring us at the eyes that we can have integration, but not wholesale integration, precisely to deal with some of the problems of the weaknesses of the Nepal army. Nepal army today is not inclusive. Let us do in the process of integration, integrate women who are not many in the Nepal army. Madeshis, we don't have many Madeshis in the army. Dalits, we don't have many. And most of the indigenous groups are, ethnic groups are actually well represented, but there are certain who are not. Those two represent them. It can be done, and then the rest can be rehabilitated. And in terms of downsizing of the Nepal army, it can also be done in a thoughtful manner, not a wholesale downsizing and firing people, but over a period of time, through attrition, through special incentives, etc. When one discusses with them, it can all be done. And privately, everybody agrees, Mr. Gautam, yes, that is an agenda that our party can live with. But the fact that it can be done does not mean it is going to be done. Because this is where we are stuck with the higher political issues. And here comes the crux. People say, we cannot write a constitution until we finish the issue of integration and rehabilitation of the combatants. Everybody seems to agree with that, except that the Maoists would say, but we want to keep our options open. Unless we are sure that the kind of constitution we want, we need this, this cannot be solved. It is related. I think that's the crux of the matter. And the second crux of the matter is, I think much more pressure can be put on the other political parties. We all know about their nastiness and their this messiness and all that. If the Maoists would truly comply with Ian Martin's message there on transformation number 2, it is time for them to have one line, not 2 lines. Yes, multi-party democracy, but of course those parties, only those that are against feudalism, imperialism, capitalism, those parties, yes. That's nonsense of a multi-party system. So true commitment to multi-party system, pluralism, true commitment to giving up violence against the method of political change, and that can lead to all the pressure that we can bring to bear. We are not able to do that, so that's where the real crux lies. There are problems on all sides. Finally, I would say I continue to be optimistic that a way forward can be found in the last minute, past the 11th hour, etc. Why am I optimistic? Not only because Nepalese have this tendency to come to conclusion at the very end, but the Maoists have proven to be, they always go to the brinkmanship, go to the edge, push for the end, but in the end, they are prepared to compromise. We have seen right now in this big Andolan that they are doing, well, they have withdrawn 2 of the demands. 2 of the most critical demands they have withdrawn. In the past, they have found that whenever they go to brinkmanship, often they prevail. But when they don't prevail, they are also prepared to compromise. And I think we need to work on that possibility of compromise that they can live with. We think of the Maoists as very doctrinaire. Yes, they are. But they are also very utilitarian. That when it suits their interest, they are prepared to be flexible. But let's make sure that that is done not only as a tactics, but on their fundamentals. That I'm not convinced. I think that is what we need to work on. Get them to change their fundamental issues on the issues of multi-party democracy, no violence. Then we can fix problems. Thank you.
Okay, I'll stay too. You started a good example here. Well, I'm a constitution-making guy, not a peacemaking guy, although I think that peacemaking, of course, is a presupposition of constitution-making. I had a chance to be in Nepal once. Closer? Does it work? I was fortunate enough to be in Nepal once, and I almost had a chance to go a second time. The State Department was going to send me a second time, but somehow the American embassy raised some objections. I guess they thought I would interfere with their business. And so I will tell you what I would have said there. I have no idea why they had this attitude, by the way. I was very critical of Mr. Moriarty, but he kind of likes me, and we still have a correspondence. Even he's now writing to me from Dhaka, and I think he probably wrote a good report about me, and so did the people who were working with him. And now, Obama administration, I'm pretty much on the left on most things, and I don't get to go. But so goes life, and somebody will figure out why it happened. Anyway, I won't trouble you with my problems. Nepal has enough of them without my issues. Let me just address some of the questions that have come up here from point of view of three problems that have kind of come up, but not, I think, in sufficient detail. And I think you can probably see that on some level, constitution making and peacemaking can reinforce one another and cannot be entirely separated. I mentioned what these issues are, and then I'll go into each one of them very, very briefly. We're running out of time, so I won't spend too much time on them. One issue is the issue of the executive under the interim constitution, the relationship of the president of the republic now and the prime minister. This has been discussed by Ian Martin, but not specifically in relationship to the breakdown of the first post-election government, and I want to address that. The second is parliamentary obstruction, which is, I think, an unbelievably important problem, and I think no one has. Well, I think Ian has also referred to it, but has not gone into it in any kind of detail. And the third is the problem of the separation of within the current Constituent Assembly of its legislative and governmental functions and its constituent functions. I think they are insufficiently separated, and that is a huge problem also. So let me go through these issues. I think it simply belongs to the essence of parliamentary government, whether it is run on majoritarian or consensual basis, that the president is a replacement of the king, but not the Nepali king, but the British monarch. This was discussed in India extensively right after the making of the constitution, even during it. And it was said explicitly, no, our president is going to be, and this was put down in guidelines, a replacement of the British monarch with exactly those same powers, namely none at all, that the British monarch had. And when President Prasad, in spite of all that, tried to take greater powers, he was told in no uncertain terms, not only by Mr. Nehru, but also by several constitutional experts, that this is just incompatible with parliamentary government. The conventions of the Constitution, in this case British ones, do not allow it. And of course the intent of the framers, also expressed in many documents, also doesn't allow taking excess powers. This is not going to be presidential government here. In Nepal, I'm not so sure because I haven't studied the documentation, but the term ceremonial president has been used repeatedly, and I think it was pretty clear that one did not want to produce a replacement of the Nepali king. I mean, this was explicit, and so whoever was going to be the president, the point was not to give this person powers that went beyond the historical conventions of parliamentary government. So the idea that the president actually has his own role in the making of appointments or the dismissal of officers is nonsense from this point of view. And I think my friend Prachanda, I say my friend because we hit it off very well when he was here at the new school, although I've been critical of all communist politics all my life, I'm Hungarian. I think he was absolutely right. It belonged to the prerogative, not the prerogative, it belonged to the rights of the constitutional rights of the Prime Minister to dismiss the chief of staff of the Nepali army. There is, of course, recourse against that of the parliamentary partners. They can leave the government and leave him in minority. I mean, you know, in a democratic government, one can do things. But it was not the right of the president to try to use imaginary powers to checkmate that effort. And so I think from this point of view, the demand of the Maoists that one condition for a national unity government is a repudiation of the acts of the president, I think is a correct demand. This demand should be satisfied, and I think that they are right to continue to protest against what was done, but not by parliamentary obstruction. That's my second point. Parliamentary government cannot be carried on in the context of obstruction. That is, nothing could be more inimical to parliamentary government, and indeed to probably council communism too, if you ever had it, than obstruction. Parliamentary government is based on speech, on communication, on interaction among partners who try to convince one another whether they can or cannot is another matter, and not yelling up and down and screaming and stopping people to speak either by minorities or fairly large pluralities even, as in the case of the Maoists. Ashok will recall that I was very critical of the great importance of ethnically based politics, which to me was endangering the political process in Nepal. And that's not because I don't want to give ethnic groups their rights, but because it was ethnic politics, the Madhesi movement in particular, that introduced parliamentary obstruction. I thought this was an extremely dangerous precedent to set, and this should have been fought from the outset, and it wasn't. It was permitted, and indeed their demands were satisfied. Those demands precisely led to a larger electoral surplus for the Maoists. That's how it works out in politics. But in any case, they should not have been satisfied because parliamentary obstruction is just incompatible with democratic politics. And I think the Maoists should trade in the concession which I just mentioned, namely the other parties admitting that that in fact the president acted wrongly in the first issue. The Maoists should renounce obstruction forever. I think this would be a legitimate demand on the part of the other parties. And I think every party should renounce parliamentary obstruction because this cannot be the basis of democratic interaction. I just don't understand why this is not generally made by also organs of civil society. I mean, it's unthinkable. Imagine if now the healthcare legislation of the Democrats could not be carried out because the Republicans would practice parliamentary obstruction. So no one could actually proceed because they would be running up and down, I mean, doing what they do in Nepal. I mean, you know, I don't want to caricature this. I wasn't there. I didn't see it. But I can imagine what it's like. So I think this is just unthinkable and unacceptable, and it must be said to them and to everybody, you know, not only stop, but also repudiate it forever. And the third thing, and I'll stop with this, the differentiation between the two assemblies. I mean, India, of course, already differentiated the two. They actually made a good job of that. It strikes me that the Nepali political actors are not making a good job of it because the job of constitution making hasn't progressed very much. Had they differentiated the two assemblies and had the constituent part not been affected by obstruction much, they would have by now produced something more than what they have already produced. It's not that hard actually to draw up constitutions, at least drafts, competing drafts with one another. I mean, you know, it may not be possible to agree yet, but at least there should be really fully developed competing drafts on all the issues. And as far as I know, there's just some sketches and some proposals, but in fact, nothing much has really been done on the committee level. And well, I can be corrected on this because I wasn't there. But I think a full separation of the two bodies would be extremely important because I think on some level it's going to be a real problem, and we talked about this with Ashok. What happens when the actual time period of the Constituent Assembly runs out? The interim constitution is a very poorly framed document, and they have not really adequately provided for what happens if indeed the time period runs out. I think probably a new Constituent Assembly would have to be elected, but this I think would be difficult to imagine, and yet it probably has to be done. So I would say that given the time frame, it would be a good idea to not to make that the hostage of anything else, and so the constituent part of the project should be facilitated, irrespective now the solution of other matters. Thanks very much.